About education alternatives and new initiatives to help our kids learn and achieve. We have Amber Arellano, the Executive Director of Education Trust Midwest, a nonprofit school advocacy group. Also joining us, Tyrone Winfrey, the Chief of Staff of the Education Achievement Authority. Also with us today is Tammie Jones, the Director of External Affairs at the Detroit Parent Network, and David Campbell, the Superintendent of Livingston Educational Service Agency. Thanks so much for joining us for our second panel here today.
Thank you.
First of all, before we start off, I'd like to ask Amber and Tammie, tell us a little bit about your organizations and how you're working with education in Michigan. Amber, let me start with you.
Sure. So the Education Trust opened more than 20 years ago in Washington, D.C. as one of the first organizations in the country to be focused on giving a voice for children, particularly for vulnerable students in the U.S. in big decisions about education, from budgets to public policies to standards around educational practices that are really focused around improving student achievement. And so much of the time in Lansing or in Washington, D.C., that voice is missing from the table, and so we opened in Michigan about 3 years ago to ensure that that vulnerable student's voice is at the table in big decisions at the statewide level.
Okay, and Tammie, go ahead and tell us about the organization a little bit.
Absolutely. Detroit Parent Network is an agency founded roughly 10 years ago, and our mission is to develop powerful parents and primary caregivers to get the best education possible for their children. So very simple, very direct mission. We believe that when you transform parents, you actually transform the city to be a better place to raise and educate children.
Empower them.
Absolutely. So we focus a lot on giving parents information, helping them develop their leadership skills, creating opportunities for parents to have decision-making power and voice over the education that their children are getting, and making sure that parents really have the opportunity as one of the few players at the education reform table to be advocates for children. The reality is, with teachers unions, with school administrators, with the bean counters, everybody comes to the table with an agenda that may or may not prioritize children at any point in time. We can guarantee you that every parent wants what's best for their child, and so that will always be the agenda that we carry.
All right. Okay, well, let's start off. I love this. People say they want to improve education in Michigan. It's a great statement, and I think that we've all said it at one time or another. So I'm going to ask each one of you, and I'm going to start with you, Tyrone. What does that mean to you when we need to improve education in Michigan?
When you look at improving education in the state of Michigan, you got, I'm reminded of a statement: if nothing changes, nothing changes. And when you look at our children, we should not just look at them in the year 2013. Where do we want to see them in the year 2020, 2023, 10 years from today? And when you talk about changing education in the state of Michigan, we have to work with them where they are to help them to get to another place. And when you look at what we're doing with the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan, we're looking at how a student, not proficient, but how they can grow from one grade level or one instructional level to another. So when we talk about changing education in the state of Michigan, it has to be student-centered.
David, let me ask you, improving the state of education in Michigan, what does that mean to you?
It means so many different things. There's a gentleman named Mark Tucker who's an internationally famous school reformer, and what he's looking at is two fundamental things: is the quality of the teacher, the effectiveness of the teacher, and then the governmental structures that are set up to support the system. And what he would argue is that many of the systems in states, ours included, are so decentralized, the power structures, that it's very easy to cast blame elsewhere. And he argues for a more logical system, a P20 type system, which I believe Scott Menzel earlier in the panel, and also Phil Power was getting at that, a system of support for human capital, as Phil was calling it.
Amber, how would you address improving education in Michigan?
Sure. So, you know, in Michigan now for about 15 years, there's been a big focus on governance. And through that time period, the state has really not improved outcomes in kids' learning. In fact, we've continued to decline. We were in the top third, then we were in the top 50% on the national assessment. We're now in the bottom third among all states. And so, so clearly, simply by focusing on governance is not really working for what's really best for students. As Dave mentioned, the most important predictor of student achievement is classroom instruction. It's the quality of the teaching that's happening in the classroom for kids. And I think in the Center for Michigan study, that really resonated with parents. Parents, we sort of know intuitively how important our teachers are. But the research bears that out too, and that's why our organization has put a big focus on working on improving the quality of teaching, and also school leadership at the building level, also a really big predictor of how well a school is going to do in teaching its kids.
Okay. Tammie, improving.
So I think from a parent perspective, the bigger question is, what do we want, right? When our kids are leaving high school, what do we want them to be equipped with? And so we really think of how can we get our kids to be productive, responsible, and caring citizens. Ones who are able to provide a good living for their families when they're grown up, and ones who are able to give back into the community in a way that increases everybody's quality of life. So when we're talking about improving the quality of education, it's about making sure that kids have access to that, whether it's in school, at home, or in the community. It's also about making sure that the opportunities they have are equitable, or making sure that there's quality options open to everybody, so that every child, regardless of what family they're born into, regardless of the zip code, has an opportunity to succeed.
All right, let's jump in and start talking about some of the things that I think all of you mentioned, and that would be teacher education and performance. And let me start with you, Amber, because the Center for Michigan, when they did their study, they asked people in terms of how they would see improvement with schools, and people said, well, we would like to help teachers more, and we would like to get more help for them, more education for them. How crucial is teacher performance tied to kids' performance? I'm going to start with you, Amber.
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally important. There's been more than a decade now of research that's shown that teaching quality is actually, it's more important predictor than a school's zip code, which when you think about it is really profound. You know, we are living in an era in America that we're living in a really socioeconomically segregated time, and often where kids live and the school that they go to and the poverty level in that community often has a huge influence on how much that child's going to learn in school, the quality of those schools. And so one of the ways that we can really provide equitable outcomes for kids is to ensure that all kids, no matter who they are getting access to an effective teacher.
So, David, let me ask you, what are teachers telling you? Are they sharing with you some concerns about how they can maybe be more effective with children in the classroom? And then are they concerned about being tied to their kids' success?
Well, absolutely. Yes, they're concerned about being tied to the outcomes, because a lot of the systems in terms of the assessment data, we're working on the reliability on that. And we're not quite there as a nation yet. A lot of the emphasis out of the federal government with the Race to the Top initiative is to study how to measure in a quantitative manner the effectiveness of instruction. And that's never been done before. And so it's the quality of the tests, the fairness of the assessments. We have laws in place related to teacher evaluation that we are working through, and Amber could speak to this very well in terms of the caliber of the assessments. And teachers are stressed out about that. Teaching, I would say, is harder than ever. When I started teaching 25 years ago, I don't think it was as complicated, because frankly, we didn't think it was that important as a nation. And right now, we know that our nation's survival depends on the quality of the instruction. And so there's a lot of pressure. Probably more than some people signed up for.
So are you seeing teacher burnout then? Are you seeing people say, forget it, I can't do the right thing, I can't teach to the test, or the kids aren't learning other things that they need to learn, and are you seeing them burned out?
There is definitely some of that. There's also some people who, you know, due to some of the reform efforts the last couple of years, there's been a lot of changes, this last 2 years in particular. The tenure reform piece certainly has teachers concerned about the stability and their, you know, can I keep my job? Can I meet these high rigorous standards? And schools are concerned about, are we providing them enough support? You want to be fair to somebody. If you're going to raise the standard, then let's give them the training, because the training that I got 25 years ago to be a teacher is not the skill set that teachers need nowadays.
And what would the training involve that you would like to see?
Well, I think a greater emphasis on technology, but not exclusively. I think technology is a part of the answer, but if we take the human element out of teaching and learning, I think we're going to lose a generation of kids. And we can get into this more later, but the online learning is a component of good instruction. A lot of kids' brains are being retooled, reformed because of technology. In a way, we've got a generation, probably ourselves included, that are far more ADD, attention deficit disorder, than previous generations, because we have our handheld devices, and we're constantly changing direction. We've got our clickers for TV. We don't stop and pay attention to things very long as a society. That makes it harder to teach. And we've got a greater percentage of kids who lack that internal self-control. Discipline is what we used to call it, that to be able to pay attention. And many kids are, that the virtual learning can meet that need. It's typically most effective when kids have that attention and they can stay focused on something and not click over to Facebook real quickly. And so it can work for motivated kids, but one also must ask, what doesn't work for motivated kids? And is that the best? Is that what the top performing nations of the world are doing? Are they moving into the virtual learning? When I read about Finland and Singapore, I'm not reading about virtual learning, but it absolutely has a place. It has a place. Salman Khan, the Khan Academy, there's some outstanding instruction there. And students can get their instruction, maybe you flip the classroom. They get their instruction at home through Salman Khan, the Khan Academy, and then they come into school and then they discuss it, because it's that active participation, the discussing of information that really increases the retention in the brain. You've got to work with the information, not just read it and regurgitate it.
David, you have all my notes, because I have all those things written down that we're supposed to talk about in about 30 minutes from now. But no, this is great, and this gets me really excited about the conversation because there's so much to grapple with. I do want to step back a little bit, and I want to go to you, Tyrone, and I want you to tell us about how the Education Achievement Authority, how in these schools now that are operating, the 15 schools in Detroit, how that teacher-student relationship is and how they reflect student achievement and the teachers
Well, first of all, the Education Achievement Authority, we have to go back to December of 2009. The state legislature passed a bill that became law and was enacted on January 4, 2010 under our former Governor Granholm, that said that the state would operate what is considered the lowest performing school or underperforming schools. And that was also in work in trying to get the race to the top grants. That law, as I see it, set on the books. It also said that the state would have a reformed school officer and a reformed school district. When Governor Snyder came in office, and you go to June 20th of 2011, that's when the Education Achievement Authority was formulated. It was instituted with him and Emergency Manager Roy Roberts in Detroit. And the basic thing was to make sure that we had a district where we could have schools that were underperforming and make sure we take those low performing and make them high performing schools. We're doing just that. When you look at individualized student-centered learning, where students are basically, as I talked about earlier, looking at where they are and how we can get them to a certain level and making sure that those students are in a setting where they're getting the attention from the teacher. When I sat in classes years ago at Cass Tech in Detroit, the teacher stood up and talked to the whole. Half the class got the information, and half didn't. Because my last name was W, or because I was tall, I sat in the back. And so therefore, sometimes I was afraid to ask a question. But now when you talk about individualized student-centered learning, we're talking about utilizing technology, a teacher as well as maybe a teacher assistant, to help that student get to that next level.
How do you measure the success or the non-success of what's happening in the EAA right now?
Well, one of the things, we are taking the MEAG test along with other state school districts, but we look at performance series testing. That testing helps us to measure where students are and help them to get to that next level. I was talking to a student at a school recently, 7 years old, just learning their alphabet. Now, can you imagine that? Most times we're talking and reading to students before they're born and so forth, and helping them to play, playing classical music and doing different things to help them to get to a certain level. But with our kids, we're finding out that they were so behind. And even our high school students that were tested. And also, before we tested the students, we assessed every school in the EAA. We did a report card on every school. We looked at proficiency in math, proficiency in English. We looked at the graduation rates for high schools. We looked at the dropout rates. We looked at every facet of that school before that school was instituted into the EAA.
Amber, is this EAA model something that you think should be instituted in other places?
You mean outside of Detroit? Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question. I think, the EAA was developed to be focused on the state's lowest performing 5% of schools. And that was the intent, and I think that's the group of schools that it makes sense to have it represent at this time. We don't really know yet. You guys are doing great work. We don't really have comparative data yet on how it's doing, though, and it's going to take some time. And so I think there's been a lot of debate in Lansing about whether this should be expanded, how rapidly should it expand. And I think for now it makes sense at the lowest 5%. You know, I mean, I think we want to see how it does, right? And we want to see how it does compared to other districts, because, you know, as Tammie will tell you, parents want to see how schools are doing compared to one another. They want to, if we're going to talk about choice, we have to have good data and really be able to tell, like, what are quality choices, what are high performing choices, right? Otherwise, choices, it's hollow. I mean,
so where do parents get that good quality data? How do they make those choices, and how important is it for parents to have that kind of relationship with their school and with their teachers, their kids' teachers?
Those, I think, are all incredibly challenging questions that we grapple with on a daily basis. The reality is, you know, the school system that we grew up in, it doesn't exist anymore. Just assuming that you buy a house in a good neighborhood means you have a good school nearby to go to isn't true. The reality is we have a marketplace of schools now. And the question is, when we have charter schools, EAA, Detroit public schools, private schools, virtual schools, all vying for our kids' attention, where do we find real apples to apples comparisons? So that we can really say, this is not about where the money is. This is not about who's getting contracts. This is about who's delivering on our kids' education. So we partner a lot with Excellent Schools Detroit in being able to get this information in a way that's digestible for parents. When we first launched
It's overwhelming. I looked at your site and Excellent Schools Detroit. It can be very overwhelming.
It absolutely is. I mean, we know when we started off, we said, okay, we'll just keep it simple. We'll look at MEP scores. We'll look at ACT scores in high school and graduation rates, right? And even that became really complicated very quickly. And then the parents realistically said, well, I need to know more about the school before I decide that's a place I'm going to take my most valuable asset and leave them there. And so then we started doing site visits where we actually had parents and community members going out into schools to be able to look at the environment and look at the school culture as best as they can assess to say, is this a good fit? And then we have surveys that are being done out of University of Chicago of our teachers and our students, being able to provide a lot more information around the climate of that school to figure out, is this a school that's on track to improve or not? Now, the reality is, in the city of Detroit at least, we have far too few high-performing options. And so this is something we have to continually work on, to not only identify those high-performing options for parents so they understand the subset that they're working with so they can figure out the one that best fits their child's needs and interests, but also then how do we make sure that those schools that are performing get an opportunity to open up more, and those schools that aren't are stopped from opening any further.
David, let me ask you this. This might be a simple question, or maybe too simplified. Is choice a good thing?
It's a great question, I think. And philosophically, I would say yes, because I'll simplify.
Why do I feel a but is coming somewhere?
No, McDonald's produces a better product at a cheaper price because there's a Burger King across the street. I mean, philosophically, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I do think that the multitude of options and choices that have opened up for the kids of Michigan the last 20 years have made Michigan one of the leaders in the choice movement. Charter schools, there's about 300 charter schools, I believe, in the state now. Full-blown schools of choice in most parts of the state. The homeschooling opportunities have expanded, so I think those options are more viable. The whole virtual learning, there's so many options now, and I do have to. And there's not much of a but. The but is, if choice is the answer, then we wouldn't be in the bottom third in performance, because we've been a high choice state for about 20 years. That's not to be taken as an anti-choice philosophy. I'm just not sure it's the answer. It can empower parents. It can get parents to be more involved if they have choice. I think that's a positive. It also creates some competition. I think it's woken up what some may call a stagnant bureaucracy over the last 20 years. And so I do see some positives to that. A little bit of a negative, I remember serving as a high school principal, and at times when seeing parents pull their child out so quickly. It's like, give me an opportunity. Don't just pull them out and take them to the next school. Let's work through this. One of the panelists earlier talked about grit, and that kids need to know how to work through a problem. Don't just bail on us so quickly. If you're dissatisfied with a teacher, let's sit down with that teacher. Let's try to work through that. Let's try to find the solution and teach kids to be resilient, to work through an issue, to talk it through, maybe involving the principal if necessary, and not just bailing. very quickly. So I'm not anti-choice. I think that, but I also think that I've seen, in my experience, just too many people quitting and giving up. And I've heard it from charter school administrators too. They'll enroll in the charter, and then maybe by November, oh, they don't like that, and then they bounce over to another charter. We've got to teach some resilience to kids as well.
Amber, how would you? Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, you know, the idea of choice it's very appealing. As Americans, we love our choices, right? We love going to the grocery store, and there's 60 different varieties of rice to choose from, and you know, it's one of the things that we really get to enjoy in our country. Competition alone, though, doesn't necessarily produce high-quality choices. So, if using the burger analogy, where I live, there have been lots of different fast food joints, all serving hamburgers. Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's. If you live in an area where your children are obese because they don't have access to high quality, nutritious food, right, and healthy food, opening one more burger joint on that strip is not going to give them a better, more nutritious food. And that's true for schooling too. So without any standards of performance for the expansion of charter schools and other kinds of choice options, we're just providing more burgers for kids that can't get a fresh vegetable to save their life, an intellectual vegetable, right?
Go ahead, Tyrone.
But at the same time, when we talk about competition, we're talking about hamburgers, but look at our university systems. As Dan Quisenberry would say, people come from all over the world and study and come to our universities because of the competition. They don't come to our K through 12 systems, but because of a University of Michigan or Michigan State or Eastern or Western or whatever, we are competitive. So we should have that same type of competition at the K through 12 as well. So I don't want to take it off of hamburgers, McDonald's and Burger King. That's one thing.
We are getting towards lunch. I'm getting a little hungry, I got to honest.
Let's look at higher education.
Okay, now I want to ask you real quick, Tyrone, before we go to the Q&A session, because the EAA is now part of a choice that a lot of Detroit Public School students have. Talk to me about what you perceive to be some of maybe the misinformation that's out there about the EAA.
Well, the misinformation is that it's a failing school district and we just want to take over Detroit schools, we want to take over the schools throughout the state or whatever. We're basically saying that here we have underperforming schools. Let's get into those schools, clean those schools up, make them high performing. If they want to go back to their school district, fine. If they want to stay with us, fine. But when you talk about individualized learning in the early panel, we did the research too. We're so behind as a state, 165 to 170 days per year for education, when countries around the world are on averaging 220, 230. So we said we're going to give a longer school year, 210 days, 220 days for our students. And the main thing, the misinformation that I'm so have problems with is that the individuals in this state help plan the EAA. The Center for Michigan went around and did community strategic conversations. We did the same thing. We talked to faith-based leaders. We talked to business leaders, educational leaders, community leaders, and basically they told us we want longer school days. We want individualized learning. We went to Lansing, we went to Flint. We went all around the state with these conversations. And also we asked them, what are your core beliefs on education? What does 21st century education look like in terms of an animal or place? And people were drawing tigers and lions and said it has to be strong, it has to be resilient and so forth. Then we told them to write a mission statement for the EAA. And they did that and we put it in our strategic plan. Then our chancellor, Dr. John Covington, said, well, wait a minute, we haven't talked to our customers. Tyrone, I want you to do a workshop with kids. I was going to do a 2-hour workshop at Youthville, Detroit, or whatever. He said, no, I want a 2-day summit. We did a summit at Michigan State University, February 3rd and 4th of last year. We called it the Super Youth Leadership Summit because it was Super Bowl weekend. We brought 80+ students up to Michigan State, and after they toured the university, we got into whether they want to see in a school district. We did a weather forecast to describe your school or your school district in terms of weather terms and degrees and so forth. You would be blown away by what kids told us. So the Education Achievement Authority, people say, is just something that's been forced on them. They have actually helped write our plan.
All right, well, I know a lot of people have questions about the EAA and have questions for all of our panel about online learning, extended school days. We're going to get into it all. So let's go ahead and start. Hi, go ahead and give us your name.
Good morning, my name's Tony Wright. I'm a high school teacher for Warren Consolidated Schools.
Go ahead, Tony.
Got a question. It brings up a couple of points that the panel has already talked about. You've both mentioned lack of consistency for the school year. You mentioned the EAA wants to increase the number of school days. You've mentioned that parents leave school districts without giving it a chance. About 5 years ago, the requirement of seat time was foregone. Students no longer have to show up for any classes. There is no mandate for students to show up to school. My question lies in this. The loss of seat time directly affects at-risk students the most. They're the ones that don't show up, and they're the ones that need the teacher nurturing, they're the ones that need the added care. Is there a plan to reinforce or reinstate that mandate so students show up the 160 days or the 210 days or whatever days instead of just, well, make your 7th call home, make your multiple calls home, and if they show up, fantastic. If they don't, they don't, and that's their choice. I think that you brought up a good point that choice is an option, but I think that the grit, the resiliency piece of the kids showing up every day and doing what they need to do to take part in the technological standpoints, take part in the teacher nurturing process is a piece to it. Child of mine missed 45 days in the first semester, and I called home almost 10 times. That child's not going to succeed. And it's tragic because I think that should be a piece of the argument as well.
Who wants to comment on that?
Well, I'll say this, even though we can mandate kids go to school and be in seat waivers and all that or seat time, but my main thing is I talk to students, they want a school that relates to them more. A lot of them say school is boring, school doesn't meet my needs or whatever. So what are we doing to not only mandate that they be in those seats, but what are we doing to help them to be in those seats because they want to be in those seats?
Do I also hear him coming back to parents and that there is a parental role here in making sure that a kid comes to
Absolutely.
school?
I mean, I think it's actually, it's a twofold at least. One is the reality is seat time with an ineffective instructor, that's not helping anybody. So seat time by itself isn't an end, right? You can have somebody sit in a seat and not learn a darn thing, and that's not helping anybody. The other piece of it is really saying, okay, around parents absolutely have a responsibility around setting expectations in their home. And at Detroit Parent Network, we're very intentional about lifting up that parents have skin in this game, right? That we have a responsibility about things that we need to do. The reality is in Detroit Public Schools, traditionally, it's been several weeks, if not months, before they've hit the mark they need to get the federal funds because they don't have the right average daily attendance marks, right? Well, we've seen vast improvement, and that has been parents and schools working together in partnership. And I do believe that the more we can do around setting expectations at home, it's not about many parents in Detroit actually had a really crappy experience at school, right? And even our CEO got expelled from numerous Detroit public high schools, right? So in light of that, then what are you creating for parents to be able to really sink into with their kids? And what you're saying is we have this high expectation as parents of our kids, and we're going to ask them every day, regardless of our own preconceptions around how things are, we're going to ask them every day, how is school going, and try to connect with our teacher. But there has to be a return on the other side. The school has to be invested in our children the same way we are, and they have to be invested in the partnership with parents to actually move kids to the next level.
But the schools have to be engaging, and that's what we're seeing with the EAA. When we did our studies, we went around the nation. I was in a school in DeKalb County, Georgia. I'd never seen students so engaged in a classroom. You had 5 students on a smart board, 5 students on laptop, and the teacher was not the sage on the stage, so to speak. The teacher was the facilitator, and the kids were happy to come to school, and that's what we need. We can get with the parents all along, but we got to have to make sure that student wants to be there.
Okay, real quick, Amber, go ahead.
So the teacher here, thank you for your comment. You raise a really good point, though, in that it's a question of what's the state's responsibility in terms of what are the standards that we have for our schools and for our kids. And he asked if there's a plan in place to rethink that. No, there's not. And in fact, I think that we're moving in the opposite direction. Right. You know, there are proposals and ideas out there to allow even 8-year-olds to decide whether or not he or she wants to stay home and learn something online. I think we've got to really think hard about what's best for the kids, what's best for students. Right? I mean, like those are not decisions that should be put in the hands of children, right? Those are parental, and those are also state responsibilities about what we expect in terms of schools and what we know based on decades of research on what actually helps kids improve in learning, right? And generally speaking, saying to them, kind of go with what works for you, do what you want. I know that wouldn't have worked for me. I mean, I was a really rebellious teenager. If I could have, if somebody said, hey, you don't want to come to school for half the day, I wouldn't have gone to school for half the day. But if I wanted to graduate and I wanted to go on to college and I had to be there, then I was going to be there. So I think, you know, as a society, we have responsibility to say, here are the expectations that we have. We know what works for kids. Other states around the country are improving student learning, and we should be thinking about what they're doing and using those ideas here.
All right, let's go to this
I'd like
next.
could I please?
Oh, go ahead, David, real quick.
Employers need reliable, dependable employees. And if we allow students to pick and choose when they go to school in this virtual environment, are we setting them up for failure when they're 18, 20, 22 years old? I think he brings a great point, and no, there's not a plan to move back to a little more traditional model. I think Tyrone also has a great point too. Learning has to be engaging. You have to try to create an environment kids would want to come to. The truth is in the middle. I don't think it's a mandate, and I don't think that, you know, teachers can solve everything. The amount of stress that they're under and the challenge that they're facing, it wouldn't be fair to hold a teacher accountable for a student's performance when they're missing 60 days of school.
And in the center study, online learning wasn't very popular among the respondents. All right, let's go ahead to this next question. Hi, ma'am.
The Center for, I'm Judy Cunningham. I'm a Detroit teacher, retired Detroit teacher. And the Center for Michigan Studies said two things I thought that were very interesting, that parents and citizens of Michigan said that they wanted less emphasis on online learning and they wanted more support in education for educators. And but I think that's counter to the national reform direction right now, funded by, pushed by ALEC and Gates and them to have more online learning, sell technology to the schools and to go to uncertified teachers. So my question is for the panel, you know, why do schools who are persistently low achieving get inexperienced, uncertified, and untrained staff? So.
It is a civil rights issue, really. I mean, the quality of teachers, there's a lot of evidence that shows that higher poverty schools have disproportionate numbers of teachers that are uncertified. They haven't been certified in the subject that they're supposed to teach in. So we have art teachers teaching algebra. And is there any wonder that the kids don't learn as much because the teacher doesn't teach those subjects as well? And high poverty schools also have much higher percentages of ineffective teachers. All of the research over the last decade has shown that. So, so I think you raised some good points about what are our expectations and what are our standards for all kids, right? So that it's not just the kids in Birmingham that are getting the best teachers, that we know are delivering the best instruction for kids.
The top performing nations of the world, such as Finland and Singapore, have very rigorous standards to become a teacher. That's something that has to be addressed. Center for Michigan report also cited that. And it's nice to see the Michigan public tuned into the educational research, which is the sharpest people. And I'm not just talking high IQ, I'm also talking high EQ. Your people skills, the emotional quotient, can you connect with people? We need top level people teaching students now because it is harder than ever due to what they're coming from. And so that means we need to be looking at starting salaries, particularly in the areas that are shortage areas. Math teachers, science teachers, special education teachers, world languages, counselors, administrators. Those are the areas where there's an acute shortage of people, where there's a glut of PE teachers, elementary teachers, and somehow we have to look at the compensation structures in order to get us to where we need to go, in my opinion.
And I want to say I agree with you, because when you look at Finland, you got to look at the salaries and what how they value their teachers.
Yes.
But also, when you look at Finland and other countries, you have to look at how they support their teachers as well. Not only to prepare them to get in that classroom, but how they support to help those students, teachers all along.
Yes.
All right, go ahead. Hi, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lois Gibbons from the Michigan Jumpstart Coalition, and I'm an educational consultant and former teacher in the state. According to a 2012 study that Visa did, 93% of American parents have suggested that personal finance education be taught and be a required course for high school students. My question is, in a day and age of this economic mess, if you will, why is it that we're not spending time teaching something like Tyrone had alluded to, relevant to students' education when there's so many wonderful resources that are online and exciting and innovative and interactive? Why are we not teaching self-sufficiency to every child in the state?
Dave, you want to tackle that curriculum?
Well, I thought Scott's answer in the last panel was outstanding, where even starting at the early childhood level, they're looking at, is it share, spend, or save were the three options?
Yep.
I think that's outstanding. It gets to that self-discipline piece too. I mean, ultimately, spending patterns, it's a result of, do you have the self-discipline to say no to that thing that you want?
Is there any curriculum in the works like that in your district at all? Or?
Well, the state opened up a nice window a few years ago with the Michigan Merit Curriculum, where there was a raising of the math graduation requirements, and then there was a little bit of tweak there after a year or so, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, where they said, you know, the personal finance could count as a math credit. And so a lot of schools are teaching personal finance probably in that junior, senior year, which is probably a pretty appropriate place to do. Why math instruction has moved away from that, I'm not the best person to speak to it, but a lot of it has to do with the importance of teaching critical thinking skills, deep level thinking. And honestly, personal finance is not deep critical thinking skills. It's simpler math, and that's why it's not lined up well with the curriculum standards, which are about critical thinking skills.
Okay. Hi, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Chandra Moore. I'm an architect in the city of Detroit that specializes in creating spaces for youth. My question is, 1 out of 3 employees are concerned about their child every day when they are at work. So is there any type of collaboration that you guys are doing, not only for early childhood, but for those that are in kindergarten, first grade, for that after school care that can happen on site at a business?
Does anyone want to pick that up?
I can pick that up, I think, at least give it a stab and let somebody else carry the ball over the line. I do think this is an ongoing challenge, right? The reality is, because our school system only covers a certain portion of the day and parents are typically at work, then the question is, well, how can I find a place that's first safe, right? And then second, and this is where you'll find the difference between low-income and high-income communities, that reinforces my kids' learning, right? It's not that they're replicating what they do during the school day, but what is it that keeps them curious, that keeps them inquisitive, that keeps them engaged? Because the reality is, in that summer learning loss that was addressed in the last panel, what we're seeing is those kids who come from higher income homes, who have more options, are actually gaining in summer, whereas those kids who don't have those options are losing up to half a year. Right? So then the question is, how do we recognize that not only in summer but in after school? And for parents, I mean, the reality is, a lot of the times, and this is part of the role that Detroit Parent Network plays, because there's not a system like an Excellent Schools Detroit report card or Great Start Quality type of system in place, it's parents talking to each other. So having that network of parents that you can go to and have that conversation, say, okay, what is it that they're doing? Are they doing more than just watching your kids? Safety, of course, has to come first, right? It just has to, because the reality is, you need to know your kid's coming home in one piece, but you have to delve further and you have to ask questions. I can tell you that in our network, Detroit Area Pre-College Engineering Program is one that a lot of our parents, as soon as they get involved, they go through the orientation, they see what their kids are doing. Next thing you know, they're telling another parent, telling another parent, telling another parent. So I think in some ways, our job is, until something is in place that ensures every kid has access to high quality after school options, it's about making sure that parents have a way to connect with each other and get access to those. And that creates also opportunities for carpooling, dealing with some of the transportation issues, those types of things.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to pick up?
No,
Tyrone?
we are looking in the EAA. Basically, with the EAA, also the schools have a ton of what is called autonomy and flexibility at the local school level to basically have after-school programs, but we are looking to expand those, because we did research in the city of Detroit between 3 and 6 o'clock. That's when most of the crimes take place for young people, and that's when they should be in some kind of after-school setting or something to that nature.
All right. Go ahead. Hi, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Janine Ernie. I'm the apprentice coordinator at Oakland Community College. I have a very brief question, but unfortunately it's probably a longer answer. What about a complete educational paradigm shift from time-based education to competency-based education?
Tyrone?
Well, one thing about EAA, if I'm answering your question properly, we do look at mastery. We want to make sure students are not just proficient, they have to master that subject matter. And we would also like for our parents to be involved in that process as well. So I agree with you. Competency is very important.
Yeah, I think at the EAA schools, what you see is a move away from grades, right? So it's not what grade are you in third grade. It is, instead of pushing kids from grade to grade to grade, it's saying you need to master this content. And then once all of these contents are mastered, that's when you're hitting up on graduation. And I think that's something that, truthfully, it's a paradigm shift, if you will, in thinking for parents. There was a lot of anxiety. We hosted conversations with thousands of parents with the chancellor of the EAA when they first started talking about the effort. And the reality was, how will I know that my kid's not leaving with no mastery of hardly anything? Because I won't know where they are. You know, how do I figure out whether or not they're on track? And those are issues, truthfully, that parents are still grappling with, but having the opportunity to see it in the small subsection of schools certainly helps. And that way you know, because I can tell you, the superintendent, former superintendent from River Rouge, he said when he got to Wayne State after graduating high school, that's when he realized he was illiterate. Don't you think that's a little bit late? Right? So having that opportunity to really break our regular paradigms, which go grade to grade to grade, and look at mastery, I think is a huge opportunity.
And just to follow up with that, I just spent 14 years at the University of Michigan directing its Detroit office before coming to EAA, and 7 years at Michigan State University. Go blue, go green, go white.
Go blue.
So anyway, when those students, when you look at the transcripts and you look at the writing skills and you look at when students apply to these universities and over 3,500 schools in the United States, mastery is extremely important. And parents get so caught up in my son or daughter being a 3.5 or 3.8, 4.0. Take that out. You need to look at how, if they mastered that subject matter and also the curriculum, because colleges and universities want to see how the level of AP or honors classes or accelerated classes those students have. That's extremely important.
Okay, all right, but I'm going to jump in as a parent here and say, but can I need to label something. Like I need to have some kind of something that tells me something. So David, I know that's the most roundabout, I don't even know what she just said. But isn't it hard, though to think in those terms though, that you need to at least say, stamp, they've got X grade or they came from X grade, that you can't always just deal in a mastery of a concept. Well,
it's a mastery of a concept, and yes, that can be very clear to you on a well-developed report card that's much more complex than a simple A, B, C, D, E kind of report card. So it can be clear like that. I would argue, one thing I'd add to this is we need to not just be talking about mastery, we need to be talking about maximizing every student's potential. Because if all we do is just talk about mastery and getting all kids above this bar, what if the student's capable of getting above this bar? If we go to a total seat time model where, well, once you master it, then you can go home, we have just lowered the bar for a lot of kids. And so it's about maximizing every student's potential.
Great point.
That's the problem, right? And so the risk is that moving to something that there's no standards in terms of what is competency, right, in a state that has continued to decline, and even had problems with state leaders lowering cut scores on state assessments so that it looked like kids were actually doing far better than they were. There's a lot of risk in too quickly moving over to systems in which we don't really have the data infrastructure. We don't have things in place so that parents know, like, okay, my child is on track to go to Michigan State or wherever it is that he or she wants to go to. So they're not getting into 11th grade and then doing horrible on the ACT, or they're not graduating and saying, oh my gosh, I don't really know how to read as well as I thought I did.
Okay, next question. Hi, ma'am.
My name is Raven Jones Stambro, and my question is for Tammie. What existing partnerships does the Detroit Parent Network have with schools in Detroit, and how can parents who are unfamiliar with the work that you do become more involved?
Oh, I love you. I'll take it, and I'll get you your money later. But, no, I think, so the easiest thing in terms of every parent, for Detroit Parent Network, we actually started independent of school systems on purpose. Because as much as parents need to be partners with school systems, there also needs to be an element of somebody who's saying, it doesn't matter which district you're tied to, that your child deserves a great education. So that's where we started. So the short answer is you can certainly become a member of our agency. It's $5 and 5 volunteer hours per year. Just go to DetroitParentNetwork.org or stop on by our offices. In terms of the work that we do with school districts, and this is more recent within the last 3 years, we do have contracts that exist with Detroit Public Schools to do some of their parent engagement work. We operate 8 parent resource centers throughout the city, and we have parent organizers that work with the parent leaders in every single school of DPS to be able to help them navigate the systems and ensure that they're getting the best outcomes possible for kids. We have a similar contract with the EAA, and we have just recently in the last month opened 2 parent empowerment centers in those schools to create a space where parents can come in and get supports. And then we also offer a variety of workshops and trainings in both charter schools as well as in churches, youth development organizations. Just give us a call, check out our website. We're happy to be support to parents.
Sounds good. Go ahead, sir. Hi there.
Jesse Jackson III from fathersinschools.com, and I guess I want to just ask a question and get a response. From everything I've heard, I've really begun to understand while students are the most important thing, we know who's driving the car, it's the parents. So what is our approach to making sure that our parents can support, so we don't lose our work, so we can invest $200 million into our students, but if you look at the data and see that parents don't have GEDs, parents didn't complete, parents didn't maximize their potentials, parents are disgruntled with their life and where they ended up, what is our approach then to making sure that our parents can actually be what we want the students to be, because that's how we don't lose our work?
So I'll take the first go at it and then I'll be quiet. I can tell you at Detroit Parent Network, it's funny to me that you mentioned this because we've seen in our project graduation program, which works with kids in 7th through 12th grade, typically first generation college students, to make sure they're on track to finish high school and successfully enroll in college. What we've seen in that program as we give parents tools to really make sure that their kids are on track and getting ready to get into college successfully is that the parents themselves start asking questions. Financial aid, is that available to me? And we have our parents then going back and enrolling in programs part-time so that they can actually build their own strength and they can be a model to their kids. Regardless of where a parent is, I guarantee you they want better for their children. And so to me, the question isn't you know, whether or not parents want what's best for their kids, it's what information, what supports do they need to be able to get that successfully. And that's really where we try to focus our work.
And also with parents, part of my role with EAA, I'm also in charge of expulsion and suspension hearings, and I sit and listen to parents, and I look in their eyes. A lot of them don't have hope for their children, and that translates to their children not having hope. And it's really, it's really such a negative experience to sit and talk to a parent about their child in that punitive way. But also I'm finding is that a lot of times these students don't have parents that are caring for them. They're homeless. They're on the streets and so forth. So whether the parents are there or not, we need more mentoring of our young people as well.
And there's so many facets to this issue, and this has been a wonderful panel. This has been a great conversation. Our early childhood conversation has been great as well, and I want to thank you all for being here. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I know we've got questions lining up here, but we so appreciate that. That is going to do it for our conversation on education today. Thank you to all of our panelists for participating and sharing their expertise. It was an energizing and informative conversation about the future of education in Michigan. And if you would like to get involved, there are many opportunities for you to do so, from writing your legislators and sharing your concerns about education to volunteering with education-focused organizations in your neighborhood. If you would like more information on the Center for Michigan's report, you can find the link at our website at dptv.org. For all of us right here at Detroit Public Television, I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.